start with the question that's been alluded to in different sessions, which is bias and the potential of these AI systems being run as black boxes, and we don't understand how decisions are made. Jen, can I ask you, how are biases introduced into algorithms in the first place? I think I'd love to anchor it in reality with a few examples before talking about possible solutions.
Okay, great. So that's an excellent question, and it's something that I think has been touched on many times today, but we can just dig into it a little bit deeper. So if you think about a machine learning system, everything that a machine learning or AI system is picking up, it's typically picking up from data, right? So biases that are introduced into these systems are not coming directly from the people who are sitting there programming these systems. They're coming usually from the data. And this can happen in a number of different ways. So one way that this can happen, and often does, is if the data is just not representative of some underlying population. So for example, if you have a speech recognition system and you're training this only on, or primarily on male voices, then this system is going to do well on voices that are similar to the ones it's been trained on. So it's going to do very well for men, and it's going to do less well for women because it just hasn't had enough data to learn well in those cases. And this was true for some early speech recognition systems. You can see this is particularly concerning if you're thinking about something like machine learning for health or medicine. If we have data that's coming primarily from, say, upper class or upper and middle class patients and less so from other patients, we might end up with algorithms that perform well for them, diagnose them well, and less well for others. Another way that bias can get into algorithms through data is that a lot of our data actually comes from humans, and so this data just reflects biases that already exist in society. So as an example here, there are a lot of translation systems out there that are trained on collections of language that were collected through news articles, things like this. And these pick up on the ways that we use language as humans. So it got some attention recently that if you tried many popular translation systems translating from Turkish, which is a language that actually doesn't have gendered pronouns like he and she, it just has a single pronoun, to English, then if you translated a sentence, pronoun is a doctor, this would translate to he is a doctor, whereas if you translated, this gender neutral pronoun is a nurse, you would get she is a nurse. And this is not something that people were automatically building into the system, it's just, the way that these words are commonly used in language that's being picked up on.
What's most concerning to you? And then I'd like to bring in our other panelists. But when you think about this, so these are very practical examples of bias, not necessarily affecting people's lives. Some are examples that are just annoying. But where does this lead, and what's your greatest concern about how this will play out?
I would say that a lot of these examples do actually impact people's lives to different degrees, right? So there are examples that have been brought up earlier today that get a lot of attention, like machine learning for criminal justice, machine learning that's being used to decide if people should get a loan or not. And these are clearly affecting people's lives in this very obvious way. But there are other examples where bias is entering into machine learning in more subtle ways that can still be harmful. So for example, a year or so ago, I wanted to take my small daughter to get a haircut, and I wanted some inspiration for this, so I started searching online for pictures of toddler haircuts, and on several different platforms that I tried an image search on, all of the images that came up were pictures of white kids, mostly with straight hair, mostly blonde, surprisingly mostly boys. I'm not sure how this crept in, but this is something that it's less clear, it's harder to make a case for exactly how this type of bias impacts someone. It's not as big of a deal to an individual, say, as being sent to prison unfairly or being denied bail, this type of thing. But these types of harms, which my colleagues at Microsoft are studying, they call representational harms, can also have big impact on people's lives. They kind of build up.
Tolga, take that. There's clearly problems. Also, AI it kind of reflects human anxieties. I mean, the coverage is so negative. But what is most concerning to you as you think about these biases or potential for wrongdoing?
Yeah, I have a little bit of a broader maybe definition of, I think bias is one way that unintended things can cripple into the AI algorithms and result in unintended outcomes. But I think beyond that, there's two other things that we particularly at Park are looking at. AI for systems in particular. If you think about autonomy and autonomous systems and robotics and intersection of AI with IoT and those kinds of platforms and devices and systems, there is also the notion of safety. There's also the notion of trustworthiness when it comes to operations and particularly autonomous operations of those systems and whatnot. So I think, and we've got some recent news about how that can actually present itself in the case of self-driving cars. So I think it's going to be more and more prominent as autonomy prevails and becomes more and more permanent in the systems that we interact in a daily basis, whether that's our smart thermostat to our voice interface, Google Home, Alexa, whatever, to drones, to autonomous driving cars, et cetera. I think that's one of the things we need to really be careful about developing these algorithms that really power those systems, is making sure that they operate in a safely, in a safely fashion, as well as demonstrate the level of, I would say, common sense that we humans have when it comes to being trustworthy, really understanding what's right and what's wrong, even if it goes beyond their initial definitions of how they think they should operate.
Okay, Tenzin, are you of the opinion that if one is aware of bias or ethical issues at the beginning, one can design around that? Are there actually design solutions to this, or is it an ongoing issue?
I mean, it is an iterative process, but I do believe that the more designers are aware of the ethical concerns regarding, the quality of data. It's not that we don't have a lot of data, but whether the data is, decent in quality, whether it represents a diverse segment of population and all, then I think we can design certain mechanisms that allows algorithms to learn in the same way that humans learn. So to say that racism as an unintended consequence is not true. People learn it. It's a learned trait. If the biases go unchecked, it simply does that. Machine learning and AI systems will put biases on steroids. The topic ghost in the machine is then, the moral agency around it gets a bit skewed when, in a criminal justice system, a judge unfairly, gives an 8-year sentencing to somebody who should not be deserving of it. And the judge comes back and says, no, but the system that was given to me, the machine learning system or the AI system actually gave that data out. So the issue becomes, who eventually will be held accountable for these kinds of things, because it's not like we are waiting for these systems to be perfected before deploying them. So criminal justice systems in the United States are already using some of the systems with biased sets of data.
Right. Right. Well, how much of an answer is transparency? So, for example, in either criminal justice or in hiring decisions, a lot of the startups that are working in this space are, okay, well, we self kind of surveil and we'll check to make sure we're not biased and compare it to human decision making or the sample pool, for example, of applications if it's hiring. How much of a cop out is that, or how much of a solution is that? Tenzin, you're smiling, so you don't seem convinced.
I think you want to?
No, go ahead.
So I think it's a problem and a solution, both, I would say, but it's definitely a requirement, right? So it's a necessity that we all have to think really hard about, how to bring transparency to AI algorithms, because, as we all know, they operate in a very, very black box fashion today. All machine learning systems, essentially, you feed data in, and then it comes up with a recommendation, with a decision, and there's not an easy way. In a lot of cases, there's just no way to go back and really understand what were the set of assumptions that was made by the algorithm, what were some of the paths that was perhaps considered and eliminated? And what was the final recommendation that was suggested by the algorithm and why? And that's inherently a tough problem. It has always been a tough problem, but the way AI penetrates into the society in all verticals and many different applications, it's becoming more and more a necessity that we think really deeply about how to solve that problem, because I believe that would then constitute one of the first steps towards addressing bias, addressing some of these liability issues and other things. But more at the fundamental level, I think there is a trust. I don't want to call it issue, but it's a trust that needs to be established between human agents and AI agents in some form. And I think transparency is a big step forward in establishing that trust.
Sorry, Jen, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I agree that transparency is very important, but I think it's just a huge open question right now, what types of transparency are actually helpful, and what types of, if you give a reason for a decision being made, what types of reasons are helpful. I was talking recently to a colleague who works in policy who was telling me that even in areas where these things are highly regulated, like credit in the US, there are rules that you need to give some sort of decision or some sort of explanation for why decisions were made, so why somebody has low credit, say. But there aren't actually rules around what these reasons mean or how these reasons relate to the models or algorithms that were used to come up with these decisions. So, if somebody has bad credit, you could give them the reason that, their salary is very, very, very low. This is kind of the thing that they would need to change most in order to get good credit. Or you could give them a reason that, if they had had a job for a week longer, they would have gotten credit. This is kind of the thing they would need to change least in order to have good credit. And the law is very shaky on which of these explanations it wants. It just requires some explanation be given.
Mm-hmm. So the one idea is transparency. Another idea, and a combination of transparency and self-surveillance, trust a company, or potentially trust the government to make sure that these are ethical. And so then the question is regulation. And is regulation a cop-out because there is no real way to design effective regulation for some of these ethical considerations? Or do you think it actually might be a solution depending on what we're solving for? Tenzin.
I think it's a useful solution. I don't think government alone can do it. I think it needs to be a public-private partnership around what kind of regulatory framework would be useful. Governments in most societies, except for certain societies, in these kinds of cases is actually 5 years behind, or if not 20 years behind. So technology gets deployed, and then government sort of is coming to terms about what kind of framework should be designed. I think there needs to be some intent around self-regulation. That needs to come from companies themselves, and not just as a lip service, not just simply putting trust and transparency into their vision statement and saying, it'll be nice to reach more customers and talk about trust and transparency, but literally sort of looking at models that would allow for that. One of the things is that human intelligence operates on different bandwidths. So it's very difficult to replicate common sense, intuitive intelligence, these kinds of things in machine learning models yet. So when we talk about trust or building trust or transparency, I think we do need a regulatory framework that at least most people agree on. Companies argue that it might slow down the development and things of that nature. But one of the things that I keep reminding people is that evolutionarily we have sort of gotten into the sense that we learn from mistakes. And we have sort of romanticized this notion of learning from mistakes. But at some point we have to recognize that with deployment of machine learning and AI systems, the mistakes might be at a scale that learning might be just way too costly. And so we cannot sort of use a similar kind of model of learning from mistake and saying, let's just design a system, deploy it, and then we'll think about regulatory frameworks.
One of the things at The Economist we've written a lot about is the brewing tech backlash that we're seeing, we call it the techlash. Is that likely, so with, and I think the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica conversation around privacy and data leakage is evidence of that and will fan that. Is that likely to harm or help the design of some of these systems in the future, i.e. is the techlash going to prompt actually ill-conceived regulation or stall progress on thinking about how to open up some of these systems or design them more effectively? Or do you think that actually that skepticism and pushback will be healthy for the technology industry?
I mean, I think it's going to be a little bit of all the above, really. I think companies that are building platforms of, Facebook nature, let's just say, is going to be more careful going forward, including Facebook itself, as it declared. To think deeply about how to protect the data and the privacy of its users that it's serving. So there's going to be some sort of a self-selection there in terms of really being careful about it. In my mind, there is no doubt that this would accelerate some of the discussions around regulation and how to think about that as well. I think the open question is whether that's going to hinder innovation and progress of technology or slow it down, or whether it's gonna really kind of build a partnership. I think building on your idea of public-private partnership word here is very, very critical, I think, because there is not one dimension here to really devise a solution. This is a very complex problem. The companies need to work together with the government, with the regulations, and I think the developers, the algorithm developers, even at the individual level, have some stake at this, and they need to think about what they're doing and how they're developing these algorithms and what the scale is, and start thinking about that, as well as the end users as they interact with these algorithms and whatnot need to be thinking about what data to share or how to interpret the recommendations that are presented by an AI algorithm, et cetera. So it's going to be a little bit of all the above, I think, in my mind.
I think it's a moment of reckoning as far as civic society is concerned, because one of the questions that we don't often ask when we design large platforms like Facebook and so on, because we sort of oversell just one qualitative aspect of it, like social connection and things like that. The question to ask is, can institutions that we hold so dear, such as democracy and privacy and so on, will these institutions survive the kinds of technology platforms that we are developing? So simple thing, that the founders of internet, when they created internet, they had an ideal vision of internet as democratizing information, free flow of information, and so on and so forth. Today, the question is, can democracy survive internet? So these are the things that as a civic society, I think we are at an interesting moment that we need to deeply think about.
What do you think?
At this stage, probably not.
Oh, good. I thought you were going to give me something uplifting. No, the answer is that democracy will not survive.
In most cases, I do like to give uplifting responses, but just the kind of, I think, data that's coming out on things. Not only from US, but even other countries that are holding democratic elections.
Don't take this week as an example.
Exactly, that's right.
This has been an interesting week.
One more question from me, and then I'd like to open it up to all of you. The idea that some of the, so I think autonomy is a great example where it seems like there needs to be clear ethical guidelines for how these systems work. Every community might reach a different decision about what an ethical response would be. So like the classic kind of dinner conversation in the valley is, should the self-driving car, if it's being driven by 5 octogenarians, swerve and kill themselves to save the toddler that happens to be on the side of the road. And the trade-offs with what is the value of a human life, what is an ethical decision. I don't know that there's going to be a national agreement on that, let alone an international standard or even a local standard where people agree. So how do we get to an answer? And is it ultimately just going to be the company's answer, or will it be a national one? Jen?
That's a good question. I mean, for this particular question that you brought up about, should the car sacrifice its own passengers to save someone on the road? I really don't think that there is any way that, we can come up with some answer to that question that's not going to infuriate some large part of the public, right?
But doesn't there have to be an answer to that question? If these cars are going to be put on the road?
I mean, in some sense, these cars are at some point going to be facing these types of decisions, and they need to figure out what to do. It's really tough, though. I mean, one thing is that we want to make sure that it's not just the engineers who are designing these systems who are answering these questions. We want to make sure that we're getting input from a lot of different places. So maybe this is the public. Maybe this is bringing in ethicists into companies, bringing in more social scientists into companies, bringing more policy people into companies, and so on, and having everybody work together. I think in a lot of cases, we've seen all of these various sketchy behaviors pop up in companies because it is largely engineers who are making these decisions as they go, and they don't have training and thinking about these things. I think, going forward, in addition to all of this, we're going to have to start training computer scientists and training engineers and programmers to take these issues seriously and think about ethical concerns.
So, because the advice everyone gives is that people should study computer science. So you're saying the computer scientists should study history and literature?
Absolutely. I mean, I think computer scientists should be studying more social sciences and more ethics and learning about these things.
I think it's not, which one should do the other one.
Yeah.
I think the complexity in the world that we live in is steadily increasing. The problems that we're facing, that we hope technology would be part of the solution for, are becoming more and more complex. This is one of those cases. I mean, our educational institutions and academic institutions are designed in a way where they're sort of disciplinary silos into how we train our next generations and whatnot. But if you actually look at what happens in the real life and what kind of collective mindset and input we need to solve those problems, sometimes there's these gaps that happen. I think it's not one versus the other. I think more and more we need to start thinking about how do we think about diversity and inclusion and multidisciplinarity, if you will, when it comes to building teams to solve these solutions. Yeah, Jan is absolutely right. I mean, if you only put it on the shoulders of engineers or computer scientists or sociologists or whatnot, you're likely to get solutions that are far from optimal.
Tenzin, did you want to take this one on?
I'll give you two brief anecdotes. One of our groups at the lab actually did a massive study on how a self-driving car should make decisions. So we collected several million data points around this. And the most interesting sort of nuance to that was that, so they went through and made like kind of decisions in different kinds of scenarios. And one option that was given was, if you were going to hit like 3 kids and a pregnant woman and so on, should the car self-destruct by killing the owner? Most people opted for the car to self-destruct, but then they also said they would not buy the car, however other people should. So it tells you, of the moral preferences that we like to make. In the case of Germany, where they actually, where the engineers actually proposed initially that, if you have to choose between young people and old people, the car should actually swerve, killing an old lady or something like that. And the EU actually opted and said, no, the car should just go straight, and leaving it to chance, so to speak. Another company in Japan that we were consulting with, when we asked the question to designers that, you have the car and on your left side there's a motorbiker with helmet on, and to your right is a motorbiker without helmet on. And in case you really need to swerve the car, which way would you go? Most Western countries, people say, you should swerve to the left by hitting the guy who has the helmet on because the guy has actually added protection and so on. In most Asian countries, they say, no, the car should go to the right because the guy was already breaking the rule. So why, punish the guy who's actually following the rule? So what I'm getting at is, is that, plus one to, of course, the interdisciplinary and diverse kind of references, but you have to take cultural norms into place of how people drive and so on.
Yep.
I'm Michelle Wooker. I'm the author of The Gray Rhino. In China recently, there was a dispute between a big social media company and the phone company over who owned the data that was there. And I think the dispute's still going on. But a question ties into the debate now over personal ownership of data. And so I would love to hear your views on the ethics of who gets to own the data that we're all feeding into the system and that's being leaked all over the place.
And I think it depends on the industry, but any takers? Obviously, Facebook owns all of our data, right?
Do you want an optimistic view or a grim view?
We have 1 minute and 50 seconds.
My grim view is privacy is dead. I think it's most of the battle against around privacy is mostly battle of sentiments and ideas at this stage.
And can I ask you on that? Like, do you think that is it just starting to die? And does it? My point is it only going to get worse from here? Is really.
Well, it depends. It depends on your perspective. So most millennials, when you ask them, they don't have the same kind of relationship with data as the previous generation has it. So for them, it's not a worst case scenario. But I think for the previous generation, it does become a challenge that how far would data will be shared, and especially when it comes to something more personal around, like healthcare data and so on. But I think, anytime we sign up for most services, we are already sort of giving up on the freedom of keeping data to ourselves. So.
Okay, so privacy is dead. And did you have any other good news for us?
Humanity could survive.
That is a cheery note to end on.